All right, welcome back to another episode of Path of Purpose. Today I have my guest, Jacob Rolsen. Jacob, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Jason. I'm excited to be here.
All right. So today marks 3 years sober for you. What has that
Yeah.
journey been like?
So every year, like these past 3 years that I've had of sobriety, it's kind of like a birthday for me because when I have had my birthdays in the past, I have like thought about the last year of my life, at least when I was like in sobriety, and then it kind of transitioned into just being my sober date of thinking about how my life has changed within the past year and like what I've been able to accomplish. So I would say, you know, the last 3 years it's been a completely new life.
Mm,
It's
what
been a
what
completely new life, yeah.
in what ways does it feel different now than it was right when you started?
Right when I started to get sober, I mean, when I first started to get sober, man, I just wanted to kill myself like all the time. Like I didn't want to be on this planet. And I was experiencing so much emotional pain. So yeah, it took a while for my mind to calm down. Like when I got sober, I would say at my 90-day mark was like my ultimate bottom. I had an ultimate bottom like when I first started getting sober, which like caused me to get sober, and that was more of like the physical sense. And then
Mm,
emotionally and mentally, when I had about 3 months of sobriety, specifically on day 90, I remember looking at myself and thinking like very badly of myself
mm,
and dealing with a lot of emotional pain and distress and not knowing how to handle it and learning how to handle it in a different way because the only way I would know how to handle it before was by just drinking and doing drugs.
yeah,
So
wow. Wow, was that low, the 90-day low, was that lower than the like initial low that wanted you to be sober?
I don't know if I could say that one was more difficult than the other. They were just difficult in their own ways. So when I first got sober, I my body started physically like killing itself.
Mm,
So it wasn't as much of a mental thing as it was a physical thing. Like
yeah,
my last drink was um like nothing else had worked in my life to kind of deal with these um deal with these uncomforting thoughts like restlessness, irritability, discontent, resentment,
yeah,
fear, kind of like this 1,000 pound bag that I was carrying on my back from all the things that I had done in my past and
mm,
all of the obsessive thoughts that I was having just in the present, and I would say my mind kind of just running wild,
yeah,
for lack of a better term, and not being able to deal with like what my head was telling me and being unable to distinguish reality from what my mind was telling me. And as a
mm,
result, I had tried everything to kind of quiet that voice down in my head that would tell me like that I wasn't worth anything and that I was full of fear and that I was resentful at other people and just a bunch of different feelings and emotions that are inherently like natural to have specifically for alcoholics and drug addicts like
yeah,
myself. And so I tried a bunch of different things to get rid of those thoughts and those feelings like psychiatry, therapy, alcohol, drugs, sex, religion, meditation, spirituality, exercise, like every single thing that I could think of, and it didn't work. And so
mm,
my last drink, I was just incredibly frustrated with none of that stuff working to be able to like calm my mind down and get rid of these intruding thoughts that I thought, that I should physically hurt myself.
mm,
Um, and part of that was kind of a reminder to myself that like nothing worked in order to
mm,
get me out of this place, but also trying to find relief in a sick way
yeah,
from like maybe the pain that was like I would say that was a result of the physical like harm that I was doing to myself. So that was the first bottom, and that's when I woke up the next day. I was like, okay, my this has gone past my mind and my emotions and my spiritual sickness and my mental and emotional sickness, and now my body's literally killing itself,
Mm.
like fatally. So
What do
that's
you
when I
mean by your body was killing itself?
like my disease of alcoholism, because it was so untreated, was telling me that I should hurt myself,
Mm.
especially when I was drinking. Those thoughts would come more when I was drinking than
Wow.
I wasn't. So yeah, that's so basically my disease of untreated alcoholism was, it got to the point where it was telling me that I should hurt myself and that it was rational to hurt myself when I was drunk.
Mm.
And so that's what I mean by physically like harming myself.
Yeah.
That was the first bottom, and that's kind of when I decided to first get help. But to go back to your other question, your last question, the second bottom was more like emotional and mental, because I had stopped drinking, but I was still dealing with all of the mental,
Mm.
emotional, spiritual turmoil and pain and disorganization to a sense. Um, just all of that sober, which is actually arguably worse, because
Mm.
when you're drinking, you can numb yourself to a certain extent,
Yeah.
right? When you're sober, you just have to feel all of it. And I
Mm.
got to a point where I was feeling all these different emotions and I didn't know what to do with them. Um, and I also was able to look at my behavior
Mm.
when I was drinking, and what the consequences that it resulted in, which was basically me alone by myself. Um, and just very sick and in a very bad place, like emotionally,
Yeah.
mental, spiritually. So that was the second bottom. And that's when I really started to really do more deep work
Mm.
and develop a relationship with um, a higher power of my understanding, which whom I choose to call God, myself, and other people. And that's kind of where everything changed for me. There were a little bit of hiccups along the road,
Yeah.
to that point, to this point that I am at now, which is, I think, is it's it's an incredible amount of peace that I have now, where it's
Mm.
probably unrecognizable. Um, I feel like I'm unrecognizable from the person that I used to be before.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
they were just different bottoms.
Yeah. Wow. That brings me to my next question too, of like during like the second bottom, what was did you feel like you were being tempted to go back to using alcohol as like a medication?
Well, I think it's different for everybody, right? Like some people, I've seen some people in recovery that have, had intense cravings for the first like 60 days. I didn't have cravings mainly because I didn't have as intense of cravings as other people. I did have cravings, especially
Mm.
when I was around it. When I wasn't around it, it was a little bit better. But when I
Yeah.
was around it, as you know, I got sober in a fraternity house
Yeah.
my first couple of months, and then I went to go study in Rome. So there was a lot of change, a lot of alcohol around it. When I was around it, yes, I would have thoughts about drinking it, but that's what makes me an alcoholic. If I didn't have thoughts
Yeah.
about drinking it, then I wouldn't be here, right?
Mm.
It would be more of a sign of being like a normal drinker. Like if alcohol had done all of those things to me and I
Yeah.
didn't want it, then maybe that was a sign, okay, maybe I'm not an alcoholic.
Mm.
But the fact that even though alcohol has destroyed every aspect of my life, and the traits of alcoholism, specifically untreated alcoholism, has destroyed every aspect of my life, and I still have the thought of using it and drinking it, is what makes me like, it's an alcoholic thought. But
Mm.
I did
What do you mean
have
by that?
like so something the way I would explain it is this: if you were to have like, I don't know, let's say, let's so jaywalking's illegal, right? But you used to jaywalk all the time, and the sixth time that you jaywalked, you got hit by a car and you broke your leg, and it took you like a year to recover. The
Yeah.
normal person, when they see a busy street and think about jaywalking, they're like, no way I'm going to do that,
Hmm.
right? Like that almost killed me. I almost died. I almost lost my leg.
Yeah.
But a person who has an alcoholic way of thinking may think, oh, like I probably could get away with this again.
Yeah, like testing the limits almost.
Testing the limits, but just being not understanding that there is a limit.
Mm, yeah,
Like that part of my brain just not registering. So
yeah,
like I didn't want when I would drink and initiate like that phenomenon of craving, I would, which is like what we define as like a spiritual physical allergy. So it's like whenever I put it in my body, like I have to have more. There's no
yeah,
limit to it, right? I just
mm,
want a limitless effect, which usually ends up in bad scenarios for me, whether it's like hurting myself or not
yeah,
being able to walk or talk or something happening, right?
mm,
Um, and that's kind of like what I mean by there's no limit, right? Like if I have one drink, I just want as many as I could possibly.
yeah,
I don't want to get to number 100 and stop, you
mm,
know? Like I just don't, there is no limit for me.
yeah, yeah. Why do you think that is?
I think partly alcoholism is genetic,
Mm-hmm.
right? I haven't done much research on why alcoholics are the way they are,
Mm-hmm.
um, from a genetic, hereditary, atomic makeup.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably one of the most difficult things for people to do who are entering recovery and struggle with alcoholism, which is a lot more people than we think,
Is to
I would say,
understand
is to
why.
diagnose themselves as an alcoholic
Ah,
and to see that they are one. And I think part of
yeah.
that is not understanding why, but understanding what an alcoholic actually is.
Mm, yeah.
Like there's specific criteria to it, you know? It's like
Hmm.
like a medical diagnosis. Like that's how I would describe it.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, that makes me think too, like how or for the listeners who are listening, Jake and I, we went to college together. We were in the same fraternity. And like a fraternity is not a sober walk in the park most of the time. So like what was like that experience of like becoming sober while you were in college when most of your friends are built around this culture of drinking and partying and having to like take a step away? Like what was that like?
Yeah, that's a very important question. First, I want to address this thought that I just had, which puts it in perspective. I'm pretty sure the number of alcoholics that get sober in the world is less than like 3 to 5% of all alcoholics, which is just like it puts it in perspective. Um,
Yeah.
and I just think about that because I guess I think about the amount of people that may be struggling with this that
Mhm.
don't speak up or like don't want to get help or don't know how,
Yeah.
um, or don't have the willingness. It's just 3 to 5% is just a very small number. But anyway, to answer your question, I think by the I think by the time I had healed, like spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically, I had been I had been introduced and shown to a much better life than I ever thought possible in this world, that it didn't even
Mm,
matter to me anymore.
wow. So
Like I didn't
like
even want to
yeah.
be like I hate to say this because there are some people within the fraternity that I genuinely like to spend time with and
Yeah.
appreciate like their friendship, but like I didn't have any desire to still be in the fraternity or to
Yeah.
even go to parties or clubs or anything because I had
Mm,
found so much peace where I was now that it's
yeah.
like I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Wow. What about like that initial like that part makes sense like you have a taste of the fruit and you know it's good. But like what about before when you're like making that jump, when you're deciding to make the jump and you're like, "Oh, all my," cuz like for me like if I was in that perspective, I would, and maybe because this is like cuz like I care more about like what people think of me, but I feel like I would have had a really hard time like stepping away and acknowledging that like, hey, I need this, and I don't care if I'm going to be alone in this. Like, what was that part like?
Honestly, I had gone through that multiple times and have gone back to drinking. I drank for 7 years, which, I've known people who drink for 40 or 50 years to get to this
Yeah.
exact point that I'm about to say, but it's the life or death point, right?
Yeah.
It's that point that you reach where if you go any further, you may not be here anymore. And that's like, to me, that was like what did it,
Yeah.
right? It wasn't a like, it felt like I didn't have the option anymore.
Yeah.
I was afraid of like what would happen when I would drink again. I didn't want to face more consequences of what would happen if I drank again because I didn't know I would not be here anymore as a result of just me taking one drink. That's like to the
Yeah.
point that it got. And only
Wow.
was it because of that point that I was able to like completely separate myself. Because at that point, it wasn't like a mind game, right? It was like, if I do this, I will die.
Yeah.
And that's how it was for me. I didn't end up going to rehab. I didn't end up staying in a sober house. Like, I just had people around me that loved me until I could love myself and cared for me. And I had a program of recovery that was like very structured. And
Yeah.
as a result, like I was able to put days together, you
Wow.
know? But I think it was more of just like the life or death scare
Hmm.
initially. And then after that, it was just like, you know, having enough willingness to go as far as I possibly could to stay sober. And then the rest was like God meeting me,
Wow.
whether it was
Yeah.
like 30% one day, um, or like, and I would just have enough to like pray and
Hmm.
maybe like do something recovery related, or it was like I would pray all the time, in my head throughout the day and
Yeah.
continuous cycles to just help me deal with the emotional turbulence and volatility that I was dealing with. Either way, like God would make up for the extra time, like the
Yeah.
extra ways that I couldn't, you know, um,
Mm.
that I couldn't like guarantee my sobriety,
Yeah.
which, came in various situations, like, came in the situations which I had somebody in my life at the time who loved me and like watched out for me and like
Hmm.
kind of just like um, made me feel that like I could keep going and like
Yeah.
had my back, you know?
Mm.
And that was such a beautiful thing.
Wow.
Like, and also just like friends, like even in the fraternity house, like guys would completely support me,
Yeah.
like, and just like ask me how I was doing, like, so tell me they support me. Um, and also just like I had a community of recovery that I could immerse myself in. And
Mm.
that was like a game changer too. So with those three things, it was just like God, just like God helped me and spoke to me through people
Yeah.
mainly, like, and that's how I think God speaks to me in general. And I don't mean like a religious God like some people do. I don't, because
Yeah.
like I just created my own conception. But whatever higher power like someone chooses to believe in or not, I just feel like
Yeah.
the universe and this higher being speaks to me through other people, you
Mm.
know
Yeah.
so like, yeah.
It sounds like this experience led you to God.
Yeah, I mean, God was there the whole time, right? Like, and
Yeah.
like I said, something that really helped me in recovery was not thinking of God as like a religious God, because I was open to, I was taught that God was I had the perception from specific teachings that God was a punishing God.
Mm.
And as a result, like I had a lot of fear based around God and thought like if
Yeah.
there was a God, he would want nothing to do with me because of all the bad things that I've done in this world, like some really
Yeah.
messed up things, that I was
Mm.
carrying around with me, like on my soul.
Yeah.
And I was unable to let them go. And as a result, like those things dragged me away from God, like resentments, fears, and then drinking on top of that in order to get away from those things completely like took God out of my life.
Yeah.
Like I used drugs and alcohol as a substitute for
Mm.
like a higher power. Um, but I was God has been there like all along, I think.
Yeah.
And but
Me too.
my perception of God changed.
Yeah.
So before it was like this like punishing, like you either believe this or you're not a part of like whatever I have in store for you type thing. And that
Mm,
kind of led me away. And then my alcoholism just took me completely away and shut the door. But then once I was told I could create my own conception, I chose a couple of characteristics. So
yeah.
it was like calm, kind, loving, compassionate, and forgiving, or something like that. I have them written
Yeah.
down. And then whenever I thought of God, I just thought of those things.
Mm,
And, as I prayed and meditated and like tried to emulate those characteristics that I chose with my higher power to be, I felt like I was drawn closer to it.
mm,
And now I feel like I have like a relationship with it where it's like it's everything, you know?
yeah. Amen. Can I share a verse with you, a Bible verse with you that made me
Yeah,
think of?
sure.
Yeah. There's a verse, I think it's Romans 8:1, but it says, "For there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." And that this notion of that God God loves us no matter what we do, no matter how we are, no matter what we do, no matter yeah. And however, it's these actions of what we do, for instance, our sin. I say that word kind of lightly because it carries a different kind of connotation for different people, but it's our actions that separate us from our relationship with God. It's not that God doesn't love us, but it's that, for instance, by doing certain things, we aren't able to fully experience God's love for us.
I agree. The problem, sometimes the problem that I get is I think that there are a lot of people that try to put the concept of God in a certain box where I
Mm,
think it's like, it's very personable to each human being,
yeah,
and it's very personal. The conception should be personal. And I think that's what is like, I think that's kind of what sometimes the idea of God misses.
mm,
Um,
the idea of God misses, or
not the idea, I guess, the teachings about like what God should or should not be is.
mm,
So, like, whether religion teaches that God only addresses these issues or those issues, like, I think to me, it helped me to have it be a more personable thing.
yeah,
Um, and sometimes, like, when I hear specific verses like that, um, not that, like, I guess I just don't understand them, right?
mm,
And
yeah,
I automatically think, like, out of that sentence, that if I don't necessarily feel in my heart that Jesus is God,
yeah.
then like I don't like I'm completely lost,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
that's that. Yeah, that I completely understand. But yeah, so let's say even if someone doesn't believe that Jesus is God, but they believe in God, and you substitute Jesus for God, which essentially is the same thing.
Exactly.
Then it's just there's no condemnation for those who have faith in God.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think one thing that helps me is like because I personally like don't believe like with my whole heart that Jesus is God. Like
Yeah,
I was raised Catholic. I was brought up to be Catholic. I went to a Catholic grade school. I went to an all men's Jesuit high school. Like I
yeah,
had been taught like Catholic literature, like
hmm
to a deeper extent, I think than most
yeah,
um like then I wouldn't say most because I don't know, but a lot of people have,
yeah,
right? And I never felt in my heart that I could believe like God to be this conception of also being a human being, right? And that's kind
yeah,
of where it loses me. So like, and to try to relate to people like you who do,
yeah,
which is correct, right? You do believe Jesus is God.
yeah,
Yeah. So like to relate to people like you who do, and to be able to like bridge a gap in my mind so that we can like relate about God in the same way. I think of like it in terms of characteristics, right?
Mm,
And that's something
yeah.
that like helped me even relate to my dad, because
Yeah.
like my dad's like incredibly Catholic and very
Yeah.
devout. And whenever he would say Christ or Jesus, I would just think a very loving conception of God, like
Yeah.
a very loving, gentle, kind conception of God.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's
And
like,
yeah,
go ahead.
it like I think too. It's like what if you look at it like just from like a psychological perspective of who Christ was, right? Like let's say we're not talking about religion right now, but like just from a psychological perspective of somebody coming and doing miracles and then being crucified, and while he's being crucified on the cross, he begins to pray for the people that are crucifying him. And just like that, just kind of trying to conceptualize like what that how much love somebody must be feeling in order to be able to do that in that moment. And so I if we're talking about the characteristics, I would agree with you that God is loving. Like God is love. And because I believe that Jesus is God, I that's the characteristics that he embodies or embodied as a human. Like that's what I believe to be as the incarnation of God in the human form.
I it makes a lot more sense to me now. When I because I couldn't draw those characteristics, right? Like I hear exactly what you're saying, and it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Because at least for me, I think like the people who believe that Jesus is God, to a certain level, I think it goes deeper, obviously, but to on a more basic level, I think that the reason why they believe that Jesus was God is that like the characteristics that Jesus has in the Bible is like their most desired characteristics in a higher power.
Mm.
So that's just how I see it. But I do understand where you're coming from. Why? So my question is, why did you pick like? Because have you always been religious or no?
Uh, I no. The short answer is no. I was raised in a Jewish household.
Oh,
I we grew up celebrating Jewish holidays. We celebrated uh, we celebrated Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah with an extended family. But like I never really had a relationship with God. I wasn't. I didn't pray. I didn't even believe in a God. And we also celebrated Christmas. So I was like kind of I didn't know what I believed in. Uh, and yeah, I didn't really know what I believed in. And I my belief of like Jesus at that time was just like, oh, like there's just like a bunch of like crazy religious people that are like, oh, Jesus Christ, and do these things. And I'd be like, all right, whatever. Like I don't understand it. And but at the same time too, like I would read the stories in like we would read the stories of like Passover. And like I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Old Testament is basically the Torah. So the Jewish pretty much, yeah, it's like the Jewish Torah, which is basically the Bible in Judaism, or they wouldn't refer to it as the Bible in Judaism, but they would refer it to as the Torah, the scriptures, is the uh it's the Old Testament. And so like we'd be sitting reading like uh Passover, we'd be reading through the scriptures, and there would be these stories of like of God splitting the water for Moses so that the Jews could flee from Egypt, from the Pharaoh. And like these stories out here, I'd be like, what? Like how would water be split? Like how like similar to like the miracles that Jesus does. And like even now I don't like really understand, right? Like I it's not like I've seen these things happen, you know? It's one thing if you've seen it happen, um but I think it gets for me it got to a point where it's just like I know that God exists, and because I know that God exists, I have faith that these things have happened. And like I don't
What?
know. I like there's no way to
Yeah.
really know. It's not like like even in the Bible there's it says in the Bible that there were like 500 witnesses that saw Jesus come back after he was resurrected, or saw that he was resurrected. And like you could read that, right? And like people argue that it's like a historical document, and therefore it happened. But you can't really know unless you saw it happen. Like I can't know, but like I believe and I have faith. But so yeah, I would say yeah, that was my upbringing and kind of where I'm at now in relation to the things that I can't really fully wrap my mind around. But I feel like that's also, or I know that's also what it means to have a relationship with God. Like to have a relationship with God, our minds, we can't fully comprehend God and who he is. We know some of his characteristics, and we know what helps us grow in our faith with him, but it's impossible for us to like truly know God.
Well, I agree, and that's why I think like at least my opinion about all different religions and conceptions of God. Obviously there are like our malicious ones, right? If you're thinking about like a very extremist version of like Islam or Christianity, or just in general, like people doing evil things on behalf of God, like malicious things to other people. Besides that, I think all of the like different conceptions of God in the world are just ways of connecting with the same thing.
Mm,
And I think it's all one God, but people have different ways based upon their like spiritual makeup that like makes them connect with that specific part of him. And I think
mm,
that's what's so beautiful about God is it's like a feeling, right? It's a
mm,
spiritual feeling. Like
yeah,
you have a greater spiritual feeling when you go into like a Christian church. Congratulations on your baptism, by the way.
thank
Um,
you.
when you get baptized or, read
Yeah,
scripture, than I do, right? In some sense, because at least I think, right, from my perspective. Um, but like a Orthodox Jew who's like very devout and studies every day in the mornings, and wears like the undergarments, and practices all of the like Jewish rules, right? All of the laws that they think are supposed to be followed in order to be like closest to God, right? Like they get that feeling specifically then, right? When they are connected to that literature or to that like way of life. And then with Muslims, it's like praying 5 times a day, right? So like, and in a very specific way too.
mm,
And, reading their scripture in a very specific way. And so I think like the beautiful thing about God is I, at least in America, you have the freedom to connect with it however you
yeah,
want, as long as it doesn't have like a malicious intent on other people.
mm,
And that's like such a beautiful thing, man. And it's
yeah,
sad that some people in the world like can't do that. Like I can't imagine that,
yeah,
right? But so I was going to ask, I know like what my point was, right? Where I actually started to see God working in my life. And that was for me, that was like realizing all the times I should have died and didn't. And then thinking there must be something out there that has protected me and kept me alive. Like
yeah,
whether it was crazy car accidents, like driving under the influence, like doing crazy things while drunk, like crazy extreme things, like the amount of times like I wanted to kill myself and didn't, like, and
yeah,
something would pop in my path, like just something intervening in my life that kept me alive.
yeah,
And that was it for me. Like, what was it for you where you got to the point where you're like, okay, there is a God, like, and I
mm,
need to connect with
yeah.
it. Excuse me.
Um, yeah. For me, I was studying I was doing my master's in consciousness studies, and a big part of that was uh, looking at different spiritual traditions through the lens of Western psychology. And So like I was reading like Buddhist texts, I was reading Hindu texts. I was looking everywhere, looking at all these different traditions, all these different religions, and just reading them all, looking into all of them. And a common theme that I found in all of them was that they all held Jesus in some sort of high regard. Like the Hindus would refer to Jesus as a yogi, the Buddhists would refer to him as an incarnation of Buddha,
Hmm.
and something in me had like it sparked an initial curiosity. I was like, okay, who's this like Jesus guy? And like why is he being referenced across different traditions? So just from like an intellectual reasoning perspective, I gained like a curiosity. And then I got into a relationship, and I had a strong pull to wanting to make God a part of our relationship. And I knew that if I wanted to have a healthy, lasting relationship, I needed to cultivate a deeper relationship with God. And so those kind of two things were going on, and then I got invited to this church, a non-denominational Christian church, from a friend, and basically went, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm able to like learn the teachings of this Jesus guy. So at this point, I wasn't yet a believer, but I had a curiosity and kept going for basically a year until I was sitting in the church on a Good Friday service, and there was this sermon about when Jesus was getting crucified. There was this Roman centurion, and for just some context, at the time, the Romans were not, they didn't believe in the same God as the Jews. Jesus and all his disciples were Jewish, but
Interesting.
they didn't believe in the same God. And while Jesus was getting crucified, this guy basically is like, truly, that is the Son of God. And the Roman centurion was able to realize in that moment that Jesus was the Son of God. And there's something in me that like clicked. And I was like, wow, if this guy is able to see Jesus as God, like there's no reason that me, as having a Jewish upbringing, I can't see him as that way. And so that was my kind of coming to Christ, if you will. And then fast forward a few months later, ended up getting baptized. And that's kind of how I came to it. So it was more of like an intellectual reasoning, but like for me, I feel like the roots of it were similar time to you while you were going through your sobriety, and while my dad was sick. Um, there was like a breaking down of my ego, and like you knew me. I was president of the fraternity, like studying business, wanting to be a hedge fund manager, and like didn't have any level of emotional vulnerability at all. Like wouldn't talk about my feelings. Does that sound right? Can you attest to that?
I think, well, so I think when, at least in my opinion, and I think I'm mainly referring to myself, as one thing that I've struggled with throughout my life is the ability to constantly have an inaccurate self-appraisal of myself,
Mm,
right? So like I think that I believe that you truly believe that about yourself, and you were the one who was the most in touch with like that part of yourself. So you would know, right? I mean, like that when I was struggling, like people didn't know I was struggling.
yeah,
I put on a face to most people, like only the people that like really truly like love me unconditionally and cared for me at the time really knew.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so when I saw you, it was like I had the conception that you were trying to do all these different things in order to um, overcome
yeah,
these feelings
yeah,
and these like struggles that you were having, specifically referring to like the painful experience of your dad dying.
yeah,
And like, I think that was, to me, I took it as like that was your way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
is was to keep yourself incredibly busy.
Yeah.
And I think that's important that you say that though, where like your journey to finding God was in those deepest, darkest moments, because like we have a saying in the recovery community that pain is the touchstone of spiritual progress,
Mm, yeah.
which was completely true for me. Like it wasn't until I had experienced pain on such a significant level, and the only thing to reach out to was a higher power, that I
Yeah.
could come, like, of my understanding, that like I could come up with concepts of a higher power of my understanding and start like
Yeah.
trying to connect with that. And as a result, like my life got better,
Yeah.
you know? And but it was only out of those severe moments of pain where I had the willingness to do that, right?
Mm,
So for me, like one thing that I struggle with now is, I've been through a lot. Like I genuinely have. I think I've like lived like two lives in one, and I'm only like 23 years old. And I just say that because like my life before, of like when I was using drugs and drinking in the absence of God, and my life now, like constantly trying to have God involved in,
yeah.
my daily life. And the times when I feel like I am the most connected with God are when I'm in a significant amount of pain,
Yeah.
And the one thing that I'm struggling with is having just as deep of a connection with God when things are going well. Because it's easy to do
Yeah.
like the right things and to dial in and to do the things that worked before when you're in pain,
Yeah.
right? But it's hard to keep the consistency and do those things when life is good. But I
Yeah.
think that's the most important part, because I think that like the enlightenment has to come from there,
Yeah.
at
Well,
least to me.
I think you also need to give yourself credit for coming to God in those hard times, because it's so easy to like play the blame game in that time of like, why me, instead of
Yeah,
like being able to like surrender.
yeah, I agree. I think that's like a point of like self-centeredness and like selfishness
Yeah.
that it's like my first, um, it's like my first default setting. And then afterward, I try to think about it. But I
Yeah.
appreciate you saying that. What did you like feel like you had contact with God like when the painful experiences of, finding out about
Yeah.
your dad and then going through that? Like, did you feel that? Right. Yeah. Anyway, wait, hold on
Episode
one
of
second.
technical difficulties.
That's crazy. Um, but not like letting go as in like not doing anything, but just letting go of the outcome,
Yeah.
right?
Doing what you can, and then just trusting that the rest will, whatever's meant to be is meant to be.
Yeah. Did you do psychedelic therapy?
Uh, I did my own psychedelic therapy. Not with a therapist. Just with my friend who's a psychology major.
Okay. Okay. Did you
So
find it
no is the
helpful for
answer.
your grieving process doing
Uh,
psychedelics?
um, Honestly, no. Not really. I didn't really think about I didn't think about my grief at all during the time I took psychedelics. I felt like it definitely played a pivotal role in searching, like continuing my search for God, but I didn't. It didn't really help me with the grieving process. I felt like the most helpful things for my grieving process was just to like cry, just to like cry whenever it came, and to like take time to like think about my dad, and then just to let myself cry if I felt like crying.
That's beautiful.
Like that, like it's honestly the most cathartic thing is to like is literally just to like cry. It feels like you're like releasing it.
It feels amazing. When I first got sober, like about, like I said, 90 days in was when I really started feeling like the emotional turmoil and
Yeah,
pain of like not drinking and kind of having all of those thoughts to deal with. And that's when I really started like to just cry when I felt like it, you know? And it's a powerful thing, man. I didn't cry for years. Like when I was growing up, my father told me that I could only cry in two situations. If I was in extreme physical pain or if I was at a funeral. And under no other circumstances was it okay to cry, like as a man, because the man's role in society is to be strong, you
Yeah.
know? And when I got sober, man, I just let my emotions pass. And if I had to cry, I cried. I would go to the
Yeah.
bathroom and cry for like 5 minutes if I had to, or, I would just let it out. And not like in a very clear public way, but like having some place to go to or having like some alone time to be able to let those feelings out because that's such an amazing feeling when I am struggling with something and struggling with some deep issue or deep feeling and then I cry and then I feel like it's all gone.
Yeah.
It's an amazing feeling. And I was talking to my friend about
It's like surrendering to what's going on, you know? And
yeah.
like I think there's a misconception too of like being emotional, feeling your emotions and like not being like what society deems as like a man. But like I they're not mutually exclusive. And I don't think that just because like somebody cries, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean you're not like taking action. It doesn't mean you're not taking charge and like moving forward, you know?
I think
Like you don't have to suppress one thing in order to do another. Yeah. I was definitely searching. I was searching, but I didn't know where to look. And as a consequence, I was looking everywhere. Like I was like very into
mm,
self-help at the time. I was like, okay, I'm going to start like right when my dad got sick, I remember the first thing I saw was a Jordan Peterson video, which was like, oh, it's a miraculous aim to be the strongest person at your dad's funeral. And I remember seeing that video and I remember like it gave me like such a sense. Oh shit. You got a call.
Jason, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, I was saying it gave me seeing that video like when my dad was sick gave me like such a sense of purpose, knowing that like I had an aim. And like my aim was to be able to be the strongest person at my dad's funeral and like at least to try to hold it together for the rest of my kind of. Oh shit, one sec. Fuck.
I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, one sec it said. No, I disconnected my mic. One second, just give me a sec. Technical difficulties.
It's a deep conversation.
Yeah, a deep convo for my mic to get unplugged.
That's all right, man. God's telling us we got to
Yeah,
take a
let's
break.
see. Yeah, to not take it so seriously.
Yeah, that is interesting.
All right, there we go.
So did you should we keep going or
Yeah, yeah, it's not letting me switch mics, but
it sounds fine from
sec.
my perspective.
Okay. Yeah, just give me a sec. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I would say I was searching, but I I didn't know where to look. So I was doing like I was journaling twice a day. Like I saw that Jordan Peterson video and like I was looking, you know? And after my dad passed, I had like through the journaling, through like starting to carve out time for myself to like just feel the grief. That's what I felt like was like the start of that journey. So like from there I realized the importance of being vulnerable and sharing how we feel and community. And so I wasn't calling it God at that time, but looking back at it now, like I see that it was him working in my life. I just didn't realize it yet. And from there, like I got like interested in like psychedelics and just as like a tool for like consciousness expansion. And so like I was definitely looking, and then that led me to uh, starting this podcast. And at the time, I was just understanding other people's like spiritualities, and and then I started the master's program, and like still looking, looking for an answer, looking for a truth, looking for the truth. And so that's kind of what my journey was like. But it really it started in that suffering, like in those moments of like deep grief and being overwhelmed with emotion and feeling like I had no control over the situation. And it was like almost like you saw me stay busy and pick up all these different things, but like it ultimately didn't work. Like it didn't work.
It was
And
maybe it
that didn't
was like an attempt to control, like try to reach like try to have the attempt of like trying to control your life when you knew it was out of your hands. Like you
Yeah.
filling up your
Yeah.
schedule and being busy, like that was your way of trying to control the situation.
Yeah, definitely. And like ultimately there would be moments where like I didn't have anything to do and it would be overwhelming how much I felt. And it was really in those moments where I really started to feel the presence of now what I call to be God, and like being able to surrender to that, and also being okay with grieving and feeling and and surrendering to that instead of trying to like pick myself up and continue going,
It's
because like
so
that's not
exhausting.
always it's not always the most of the time, especially when you're grieving, like that's like the worst thing to do. Like the Jews, they'll sit shiva when someone dies and they'll basically just sit around the house for a week. They'll sit around their house for a week and their door will be open for whoever wants to come and kind of pay their respects for the person that passed. And like this notion of like doing nothing and just like allowing the grieving process to take place.
That's powerful.
And
That's powerful. I think, wow, you said a lot there that was very important to me. But I think I think it's so exhausting trying to control my own life. Like trying to look
yeah.
at it was so exhausting for me to just try to put the pieces together and try to manifest something out of myself. You know, when I laid all my chips on the table and I still was driving myself insane about how I could further control the situation rather than just doing the best I could and letting go and saying, you know what, like there has to be something out there that solves my dilemma of having a lack of power over the results that come in my life, right?
Yeah.
And like I think connecting with my higher power now is all about relinquishing control, right?
Yeah.
And like letting go and not letting
Mm-hmm.
go from, oh, motion censored lights. See if we, I think it requires more strength to be able to open yourself up to those feelings and emotions than it does to close yourself off to them.
Interesting.
So like I think
Yeah.
the true essence of a man is the ability to show emotion and relinquish control within specific constraints rather than never being able to feel them and showing that you can feel them, right? Um, and I think maybe, I don't know, maybe this might just be my own conception, but at least from my dad's to mine, you know, I think when my dad was growing up and in the household my dad was growing up, the father was supposed to work, just take punches for the family. In reality,
Yeah.
he was just supposed to eat the pain so that the rest of the family didn't have to and not complain about it, right? And I think to a certain extent, like, yes, the man has to be like a strong person in the family, but so does the woman, you know, and arguably women are seen as like the more strong, right? Because of all
Yeah.
the things that they go through and they show their emotions. So I think that like when my dad was growing up, it was like, oh, like a man doesn't show emotion, a woman does. And that's like, you know, the woman's the caregiver and the man's the worker, you know, and now it's like I think men and women emotionally should be more equal to feel their emotions. And I think that's more like of an important like sense of harmony within the
Yeah.
world and within like a family. Um,
Mm.
so I think like I genuinely think that that is just I don't think that's a healthy way of looking at it, that men should just like endure pain, never complain about it, or not complain because complain doesn't really do anything, but not feeling emotions and
Yeah.
showing that you can feel the emotions and are able to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's like be strong, and then when you feel something, you just feel it. And then you surrender when you surrender, and then you keep going.
I think that exactly. And I think that's actual strength. And I think what just, not feeling emotions and closing yourself off to them to the point where you are unable to feel them, I think that's like
Yeah.
a wrong conception of strength that like people um have that are I think it's a generation based thing, right? Like people
Yeah.
who are older, I think tend to have more of that perception of a man than people who are like our age. But
Mm.
I could be wrong.
Maybe generally, not all.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is important to be able to feel and to keep going. I think there's something we can also learn from that generation in terms of like discipline and work ethic, and like those are also important characteristics, but they're not mutually exclusive of also being able to surrender to how you feel, because that's also ultimately where we're going to grow in our faith with God.
I agree.
So yeah.
Yeah.
All right, bro. Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciated this episode. It was great to have you on here. So thank you.
No problem. I hope to come back soon.
Yeah, dude.
Thank
We'll run it
you.
back.